What's up, family, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you all are having a wonderfully productive and progressive and positive day. Today we're gonna have a pretty good conversation. I want to talk to you about my new book, the one that will be officially for sale, already for pre-order or pre-sales, however you say it, already ready for that on Amazon, but it'll be officially for sale on Black Friday. I don't know why it's so hard for me to remember that. But it'll be for sale on Black Friday. And today I want to kind of introduce you to the book a little bit. I'm actually going to read from it a little bit and talk to you about some of the things. Again, the name of the book is Black Nonbeliever Next Door. And it's basically an ex-pastor's journey. And I'm actually this will technically be volume one. I'll be doing 4 other volumes of this book because I have to unpack a total of 10 years. And so I'll be dedicating 2 years to each book. And today we're going to be talking about volume one. So before I jump into this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell if you haven't already, and then consider joining, supporting, or connecting with this channel, community, or content in any way that makes sense for you. And then, of course, check out our merch because we do have some really, really dope merch. All right, so I think I've done everything I'm supposed to do for intro, so let's go ahead and jump into this conversation. I actually want to open up with reading from the epigraph, and all of my books always do something a little odd. I'll either do an epigraph or a preface or something, and I don't know why it's a thing that I like. Maybe it's an artsy thing, and so for my epigraph, I chose a few quotes from some other Black non-believers, some more, I would say, ancient, but ancient is not quite right. They're just no longer here, right? Some older Black non-believers who are so old that they would not realistically still be around today. So this first one is from a name that I've mentioned on this channel a few times, and that's Hubert Henry Harrison. He says, "Show me a population that is deeply religious, and I will show you a servile population, content with whips and chains, content to eat the bread of sorrow and drink the waters of affliction." That's the first quote that I have in my epigraph, and that was Hubert Henry Harrison. The second one is at the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization. That is from A. Philip Randolph, another name that I've mentioned a few times on this channel. Here's another quote. "It should seem that Negroes, of all Americans, would be found in the free thought fold, since they have suffered more than any other class of Americans from the dubious blessings of Christianity." That one is also from Hubert Henry Harrison. I had to throw him in there again. And then I think it's just the last one. "Now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done, and not some future day or future year. It is today that we fit ourselves for the greater usefulness of tomorrow. Today is the seed time. Now are the hours of work, and tomorrow comes the harvest and the playtime." That was from W.E.B. Du Bois. All right, so that's how the book opens up. It opens up with an epigraph. The book is over 116 pages long. It is broken down into 2 sections. The first section is 2014, which is the year that I deconverted, and the second section is 2015, which is just the year after that. Each section has about 10 to 12 chapters in it. Just kind of give you an idea of what these chapters are like. The first chapter, which we will read through, is called "I Was a Wreck." There's the next chapter is "College Made the Difference," and I think we'll read through that one too. And then a funny thing happened. We may not get through that one because that one is such a long chapter. But the aftermath of Trayvon Martin, which that was a pivotal moment for those of you who followed some of the interviews that I've done. Something for the Pastors, which that one is where I'm talking about like what most people don't realize is that the year I deconstructed, the year I deconverted rather, there were so many things going on in my life, and I mean, it was like a roller coaster. My church, which had been the fastest growing church in my city, which doesn't say that much. My city has been fairly small, rather small. I think that's where I was going. Rather small. However, it has been growing consistently over the past decade. But it was the fastest growing church in the city. But by 2014, because of a myriad of other factors, my church was in decline. But my star in church was on the rise. I was getting more invitations to preach at larger and larger churches. Um, and I was in the middle of like I had literally just created an organizations for pastors, planters, and preachers that in a matter of a month had grown from about three to five pastors to over 500 pastors in a matter of a month. Um, and what's so funny is even though I haven't done any work with that group since I deconverted, um, the social media group of that page still exists with over 300 pastors in it. It's mind blowing. But so I there was a lot going on when I deconverted, and so I go through a lot of this. I talk about my church being in decline. I talk about my marriage being in shambles, which was my first marriage. I talked about the fact that, which I shared this in our most recent Sunday sessions, and I think I've talked about this before. I talked about wrestling with the idea that my church had hired two apparently homosexual men at different times. And I say apparently homosexual because they weren't out or anything like that. But it was just kind of people you looked at and you were like, yeah, I kind of think they might go the other way type of thing. Um, and the first one, when we hired him, like I lost like 40% of my congregation in a matter of a month. I mean, I think it was just a matter of 3 weeks, like literally 40% of my congregation gone. And then we eventually had to let him go. But the reason we let him go had nothing to do with his homosexuality or the fact that our attendance dropped. At that moment, I was just kind of like, we're just going to have to, that's just the way the cookie crumbled. But it was primarily because he was a rising star in other areas and his schedule was becoming um, really busy and he was expensive, you know? And so it's just like, well, dang, we're paying him a lot of money for him not to be here half of the time. So we let him go. But we did, after probably about 6 more months, I think it was probably 6 months to a year, because I just took over the praise and worship duties for a while and then kind of trained up some of the other ones to be able to stand so I didn't got to do too much. But we eventually hired another praise and worship leader. Well, first we hired a female, and no, we hired him, then we hired the female. But we hired another praise and worship leader, and he was also apparently gay. But this time I didn't lose anybody. I guess we had already survived that, you know. And he actually became a really close friend and very close friend of many of the members of the church. And so, you know, we did get a healthier church out of the other side of that. But even then, in 2014, and that's what that chapter is about, they were gay. It was me wrestling with the fact that I had my church was a liberal progressive church. You know, we were charismatic, but we were progressive for sure. Um, and so I platformed constantly from the pulpit the humanity of others. I reminded people that we don't judge people for, what they smoke, what they drink, who they slept with. I used to call that stuff petty principles. Like we don't, that's not a thing that we engage in. So, and it was my way of reminding people that in spite of whatever vices you have, you're still valuable as a member of this religious community. But even though it was understood that that applied to everybody, including our same gender loving members, that was never explicitly expressed. And I was pretty explicit in my expressions. So when I'd express about people who just sleeping around and fornicating, I was explicit in my humanization of them and my and my support and my defense and my protection of them, constantly reminding people that what goes on in your bedroom is nobody else's business, you know. But I never spoke explicitly that way to support the members of my church who were gay, or the members of my church who identified as anything other than what, you know, we considered normal or natural. Um, and so, even though I was progressive and I was like, no, because I think I used to literally say things. Because so I used to, so I'm being a little too hard on myself, because there were times that I'd say stuff, and I did get this from one of my Christian mentors. Like, imagine if the sin you struggled with was something that was socially unacceptable, you know? And so I would talk about it in that ways, you know, reminding people that, you know, like, and it's kind of like reminding people that the things that you're doing, you don't feel as bad about, because nobody, people may say you're not a good Christian, but they're not going to say you're not a good person. You know what I'm saying? Because the things that you're struggling with are socially acceptable. You cuss every now and then. You know, well, majority of people cuss every now and then. You know what I'm saying? You smoke or you drink. Well, there's a high number of people who smoke and drink, and these things can be considered socially acceptable. But in the Bible Belt, you know, in a Christian church, being, you know, even while sleeping around every now and then may even be considered socially acceptable. Sleeping around with somebody who has the same, you know, utility as you, for whatever reason, has this extra stain on it, and so it's not socially acceptable. And so I was that type of pastor to remind people to give others grace, you know. But at the same time, I didn't explicitly speak to their safety and their protection and their sense of self and their right to identify, from the pulpit, the way that I did for everybody else. And that was a crucial conversation that I was having with myself, like trying to figure out, like, why though? Like, you know, why did I not do that? You know, and it was a myriad of reasons. But the first one we had already got past. You know, the first one was, well, I'm afraid that my church is going to respond negatively. Well, you hired the apparently homosexual guy, and 40% of your church left. You hired another one a year later, and nobody left. Your church was in a better place. So you had already known that the people were at an acceptable temperature, if you will, where they could have where they would have not only tolerated this, but would have likely even celebrated that, had you been the person to take that lead and make that leap, as you had done with everything else, you know. And so the question with myself was, why did you draw the line here? Why was this where you drew the line? And it honestly was because everything else I could find a biblical justification to support. Sad, right? Everything else I could find a biblical justification. Like, um, as far as smoking and stuff like that, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of a man. Even when Paul talks about the body being the temple of the Lord, he is explicitly talking about sexual immorality, nothing else. And he explicitly mentions sexual immorality with a prostitute. Hello. So, I mean, that's very explicit. So, these other things that we've attached to those things, they're not there. So, I had a biblical justification, and that's why likely I was still a believer, because I could use the Bible to support my liberalism, because we've learned that the Bible is not univocal, and most Christians don't read it contextually anyway. So, I can literally make it mean whatever I want for the most part. But I couldn't make the Bible pro homosexual, because I couldn't find the biblical justification. I didn't feel comfortable speaking to it. And I remember, because I was having this conversation with myself in the car, and I finally just kind of said, fuck it. I don't need biblical justification to humanize other people. I don't need the approval of a bronze age book of bullshit to determine that I don't know enough about somebody else's experience, their lived experience. I don't know enough to even have an opinion. You know what I'm saying? Like it amazes me how our limited knowledge of bullshit makes us feel that we have a never-ending knowledge of other people and what's best for them and how shit should go. Just a little bit of bullshit. And you from John 3:16, you got all of that. No, I made up in my mind that I didn't need the Bible to know what was right or wrong. I made up in my mind that the Bible and Christian belief, and often Christian believers, had been an obstruction to my morality and to my sense of humanity. Oh man, all the cards were falling down in 2014. Um, the chapter after that is called The Last Conversation. I know I sat there for a while because that story was very important to me. That's why it made the book. Then there's The Last Conversation, which is my literal last conversation with God. It's just the last time I prayed. There's a song that I was on a few years ago, and I think it's on Amazon Music, I believe. I think it might be everywhere music is sold. The artist name is Sig, S-I-G, and my name is on there, Darante. And the name of the song was Nights I Cried. And in the song, I opened up the song rapping, and it was, I used to pray for someone like you so I could pray again. And that lyric is actually referencing that conversation, or at least the time, the place I was when I have had this last conversation. And of course, that line is a reference to my wife. I used to pray for someone like her so I could pray again, type of thing. There's a lot of religious imagery in music, and so I was going with it. And then talk about what led to me writing my first book, which was significant. Which is I don't have significant on the shelf. I need to do that. Um, but And then that last chapter in that one is figuring it out. And then, of course, then there's section 2, which has a whole bunch of other chapters, which I will save those for the next one of these that I do, because I do want to read a little bit of this, right? So let's start with the introduction. To understand this book, you must first understand that this is not a chronicle of lost faith, nor is it a mere account of disbelief. Rather, it is a reflection on life beyond the walls of the church, where belief once governed my world in ways that defined and limited who I thought I could be. Here, I unravel not only my journey through disbelief, but the transformation of identity, purpose, and ultimately my place in the world. In these pages, you'll find no divine revelations, no profound answers bestowed from above. What I offer instead is a journey into the sometimes messy, often lonely reality that follows when you step away from the familiar embrace of religious certainty. I was raised in a culture where belief in God was not only a personal choice, but a collective expectation, an identity wrapped in generations of faith, a survival tool in a hostile world, and a grounding point for family, community, and culture. Walking away from that wasn't simply about rejecting theology. It was about untangling myself from a lifetime of social, emotional, and cultural threads woven around belief. I am not here to persuade or convince. I'm not here to diminish the experiences of those who still find strength in faith. I am here to share the raw, unfiltered account of my journey as a Black man navigating the complex waters of deconversion in a society that often equates disbelief with betrayal. For me, this journey was a slow burn rather than a sudden epiphany, marked by questions that grew louder, by doubts that refused to be silenced, and by a relentless drive to reconcile my lived reality with what I had been taught to accept on faith alone. This is the story of how I learned to live authentically in a world that prefers conformity. It is the journey of a man who dared to look beyond the script handed down to him, who grappled with loneliness, the weight of cultural expectations, and the personal cost of breaking free. In leaving faith, I found not emptiness, but possibility, a chance to build my own framework for understanding, for community, and for purpose. And while this journey has not been without pain or sacrifice, it is one I would choose again, for it has allowed me to reclaim the parts of myself that had been hidden behind a veil of inherited beliefs. Let this book be a bridge, not to convert, but to connect. May it offer a window into the experience of one Black nonbeliever who found a way to live freely, to question openly, and to embrace the complexity of life without the constraints of certainty. Whether you stand on the shores of faith or doubt, I invite you to walk with me, not as a follower or skeptic, but as a fellow traveler in the search for truth and authenticity. And that, my friends, is my introduction. Now I wish that I was doing this live so that I could ask y'all, what did y'all think? But you can let me know in the comments, and I'm interested. Did that introduction intrigue you? Did it interest you? Did it pique your inquiry? I tried to use a different I word there. Um, yeah, that's the introduction. This book is really just me walking through the process, and inviting you to take a look in. That's one of the things that, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the second chapter of the book. But that's one of the things that I got in the last years of being active in ministry that I didn't get in those early years. And that was almost the artistic side of ministry that I was always connected to, but my dissonance had me to call it something else. This isn't arts, this is anointing. This isn't performance, this is the anointing. We don't perform here. These aren't productions. This is the glory of God. But it was all a production. And many churches did a great job of productions, you know, and many pastors are incredible at the performative aspect, Oh man, it's beautiful. And when I think about it this way, and this is why I do the things that I do now, that very much comes from the pastoral side of me. A pastor is like, and of course I'm being a little flowery here. We're overlooking some of the bullshit right now just to kind of hone in on a nuance that's often overlooked. But a pastor is a performance artist. He's a performance artist, and he has um an audience that his performances have to reach, in a very real way, that it has to resonate with everybody in that audience, It has to resonate with everybody. Now, it doesn't always resonate with everybody in the audience. Most times it probably doesn't resonate with everybody, but that's the goal. When the pastor is, and the thing is, like, people think the pastor's art is just the sermon and just the preaching. And it's like, no, especially for the type of churches that I come from. My art was the whole Sunday service. Oh man. And the thing is, it wasn't just my art. Like, even today, I tell the kids, like, I still like gospel music, not the content. I like the idea of gospel music because it's community music, not the lyrics, not the lyrics, the way we sing it together. You know what I'm saying? The way we perform it, and and it's really not even just gospel. It's gospel and that worship, the praise and worship genre, church music, which will, you know, that whole genre can be replaced by community music. But anyway, a major part of being a pastor became kind of understanding that you were a muse, that you were a source of inspiration for people, but that you were also a mirror at times, to mirror things back to people. So that whole Sunday experience, the whole sermonic experience, the whole preaching experience, the music, the lighting, all of that is very performative. And I'm not even saying it in a derogatory way. Unlike some people, those aren't my problems with churches. I'm not mad that churches became more progressive and actually did better than public education school systems at creating, like like real nice places, real nice facilities. They got libraries, they got education centers. Like churches they've killed the game there. It's the superstition that I have the problem with. You know what I'm saying? Like that's me. But the performative aspect, I enjoy performances. I do. Even when they're fictional. I enjoy fictional performances. Yes, I do. Imagine that shit, right? But no. So that's really not what bothered me. But so because of that, I still am very much kind of like sharing my stories and sharing my life from that level of performance art that I learned as a pastor, and where for the man, see, performance art is I am the art. You know, I'm not giving you the art. I am the art. This whole experience is the art. I'm a part of the art. And what pastors end up doing really well is turning life into art. And they're not the only ones, right? This is what artists do. They turn life into art. They turn life into encouragement, into expression, into elevation, you know? And so that's why I write this book this book is performative. This is my performance. This is me taking my life and putting it on display in hopes that it makes you feel something. So let's read the first chapter. No, that was not the first chapter that we just read. That was the introduction. This is the first chapter. And the name of the first chapter, and this is of course the first section, which is 2014. First chapter is I Was a Wreck. In 2014, I was the pastor of a small church in Dothan, Alabama. Yeah, Alabama. Dothan, Alabama, the founder of a growing organization of more than 400 preachers, planters, and pastors. And I was completing my first degree in social science with a dual concentration in business administration management and leadership. It was truly the best of times and the worst of times, as all times seem to be. I was married with two beautifully amazing boys, and as a pastor, I was gaining increasing popularity and attention beyond the boundaries of my hometown. But my personal life was in shambles. My church was declining, and I was a wreck. It was a pivotal year for me, as internally I wrestled with whether or not I had seen and experienced enough to begin to trust or lean into my own understanding of the world around me. To be clear, that was my wrestle. I was coming to the realization that my life was not a product of engaging my life critically. As a matter of fact, I had spent roughly 28 years of my life shielding my activities from critical engagement in an honest and sincere attempt to preserve my faith. I had previously considered the intrusive thoughts of my own consciousness to be offensive to a life of servitude to Christ. However, after living that way for more than 2 decades, I could no longer force myself to ignore that following my faith had led me into a life of poverty, trauma, and shackles. Where I was in life was incongruent with what I believed, and it was time to give myself permission to take the wheel. I was tired. I remember one day after church chatting with one of my staff members about no longer wanting to wear the uniform. It was a reference to a scene in a Spider Man movie where Peter Parker had grown weary of carrying the burden of being the hero. Exploring the savior complex that pastors often succumb to is worthy of investigation on its own merit, but I digress. The point is that I had spent so much of my life trying to be the hero of a lost world that I had become a victim of my own life. There were a variety of factors that contributed to my victimhood, many of which were deeply rooted in childhood trauma. But 2014 was the year that enough was enough. I was tired of being a wreck, and if leaving my faith behind could give me a better understanding of my circumstances and capacity, it was a risk that I had to be willing to take. Man, that's yeah, like I remember all of those emotions. I remember all of those feelings that because I had called one of my friends, a very close friend at the time, and I was in tears. Um, and I was just like, man, I feel like a failure. And he's like, what are you talking about, man? You just graduated from college, you're pastoring a church, you're married with kids, you know, like you had your kids after you got married type of thing, you know? So he's giving me all these things that, you know, from this world that I grew up in, that all of these things should be important. But mm, they weren't fulfilling. Like I love getting my degree. You're gonna learn about that in this next chapter. I absolutely loved my church. I loved my kids and my wife, but my life was still a wreck. I was financially destitute, no matter how well I was doing outside. You know, it was horrible. And so I realized, like, I've done this in good faith for a long time. I've ignored every bit of dissenting voice. I've ignored the doubts of the voices of doubt, the thoughts of doubt. I've ignored the skepticism, and I've remained true to my faith and my understanding of the word and my pursuit of God's holiness, God's righteousness, God's will, God's design, God's plan, all of that bullshit. I was faithful to it. I prayed intensely about things. I weighed my decisions heavily. You know, I had to hear from the Lord before I made any moves. I'd have confirmation from the word of God. I leaned into mentors. I wanted things to be done in decency and in order. I was that guy. And it had gotten me scammed. It had gotten me used. It had gotten me abused. And though I was still smiling on the outside, I was dying to such a point on the inside that my survival skills kicked in. And I realized that in order to survive, I had to wake the fuck up. Like that. Let's go to chapter 2. All right, so in 2014, I was completing a 4-year bid at Troy University towards my first degree. I have a few professors who have made indelible impressions on my world, but perhaps none more so than Dr. Geneve Brooks. Now, that may be because other than Dr. Klein, the chair of the leadership department, I had more meaningful classes with her than any other professor. And I just recently spoke with Dr. Brooks earlier this year, probably like, and I mean, it's like not like last month, because I let her know that I was including her in my book and I sent her over the chapter. I didn't do that for the other professors that I mentioned, but Dr. Brooks was special. For every sociology and social science class I took at the local campus, she was the professor. And as a social science major, that meant I spent a lot of time in her class. It also meant that I spent a lot of time with other social science majors who were just as passionately concerned about the nuances of society as I was. And though I had often seen myself as an advocate for all people, her classes and the interactions that took place therein were a catalyst to helping me see how even my liberally progressive Christian worldview was contributing to the silent dehumanization of others who didn't align with that worldview. Because at the end of the day, that like religious worldviews, and this isn't in the book, it's just me talking. At the end of the day, religious worldviews, that's what they tend to do. They tend to draw lines. Even if they're progressive, they're just still drawing lines. You're going to draw lines to say the ones who are not progressive are the bad ones. And you're going to draw lines and say the ones who are more progressive than this are heretics, or just flat out non-believers. And so either way, you got to draw those lines. But The conversations were exhilarating. Switching my major from secondary education to social science was a breath of fresh air that ushered me back into the real world. And by real world, I mean real to me. We had people who were transgender in our classes, people who were atheists, people who were Unitarians, and of course, we had Christians. And all of them had a worldview that had been uniquely informed and inspired by their lived experiences. I guess one of the things that happened to me during these sessions was the realization that somewhere along the way, I had stopped letting my lived experience inform my worldview. My worldview had been shaped by the most liberal interpretation of antiquated doctrine that I could muster. And as earnest as it was not a reflection of the world that I actually experienced. It was a reflection of a world viewed through the dimly lit lens of Scripture. Being in the room with others who fought discomfort to find the audacity to speak their truth enabled me with the good sense to do the same. And when I did, yikes. I discovered that based on my lived experiences, my good senses were leading me towards Black separatism. Dr. Brooks was the first person to use those words to describe my worldview. Now, many of you, that should not be a shocker for. I've mentioned it, and I'm not a Black separatist, but I still do lean towards Black nationalism, and I've already given you all my reasons, so go back and watch those. But Dr. Brooks was the first person to use those words to describe my worldview. I remember when she said it because it stung and it hurt a little bit at first. And then and when I say at first, I mean just like a few seconds, maybe like a few microseconds. Because then after that, I was just like, I think I'm okay with that. I did. I did. And that was a powerful moment for me of finally giving myself permission to start saying the quiet part out loud again, something that I hadn't done since I was a child. Oh my goodness. Dang, that just felt so freeing. Just saying that like that. Because it was a practice that I had, worked myself out of saying the things that were actually valid and true for me. Because I had grown to know that if people don't like what you say, they won't respond well to you. But this is also how I became such an effective preacher, though, you know. And now I use a little bit of that today while also saying, I don't give a fuck what you think in the most beautiful way possible. I mean, I love you and still don't give a fuck what you think about me. And I'm like that with everybody. That's just true. And I got this from this moment. All right, I gotta get back to reading. This chapter isn't over. And her class was likely the first place that I felt safe enough to even begin to experiment with speaking what I truly felt. This had come up during a class discussion about the history of redlining, white flight, and gentrification. Being introduced to all of these concepts with the vivid imagery of textbooks was a reminder that I had come to these conclusions before, that I had once wrestled with these complex ideas and had reached a similar thought. It was when I was younger, when I was in the library reading books about Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, and W.B. Du Bois. Now, I don't talk very much about my childhood, and that's not because it's hard for me to talk about it or anything. It's a long time ago, and typically I only share stuff like that with people, like there has to be a reason, right? But so there's a reason. As a kid, I was fascinated with the library, and so I walked to the library damn near every day. And typically, no matter how far away I lived from the library, I'd find a way to walk to the library. So that's why, even though I've always been a fat kid, like my entire life up until a few years ago, like always, because of the amount of walking that I did as a child, I've always had incredibly large calf muscles. And it wasn't just walking to the library. My mother didn't own a vehicle until I graduated high school, and I helped her get it, you know. So we walked the majority of everywhere that we went. We were very poor. But I put that walking to good use, and I spent a lot of time at the library. And I didn't like the children's section of the library. It did not appeal to me. Um, it was one of those kids. I get why the bright colors and everything attracts other kids. Only time bright colors attracts me is if I'm in a candy store or a weed store. Then the bright colors are getting me. But for my books, no. I didn't want to read about, Billy's New Blue Dog. I had done enough, Clifford and all of that other stuff. I mean, that was fine while it lasted. Curious George was fine while it lasted. I did go through the goosebumps and all of that. But no, I wanted to know what the real world was reading. I wanted to know what adults were reading. And so I'd go to the adult side of the library and I just pick books of interest. And this is where, at a very young age, this is how I developed a fascination with people like Benjamin Banneker, George Washington Carver, who's Alabama, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, read about the Dred Scott decision. I learned a lot. Like that's why to this day, my members of my church knew about the Black Wall Street bombing in Tulsa long before it became hot news. Because people always say, "Oh, this is hidden history," and it's like I think we're being a little disingenuous when we do that. I think we're being a little dishonest. And when I say that in full remembrance of what students were behaving like in history class. See, a lot of things aren't hidden. A lot of people just aren't interested until they are, you know. And so, but no, I knew about Black Wall Street. I know about Rosewood. Um, there's ones in Georgia, North Carolina. There was a situation after slavery had been abolished where there were still people in Georgia. I forget the word that is called. It's like peonage. It might be peonage, but it's basically debtor slavery, where that was still going on in Georgia for a long time. Um, I knew about the battles between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. I knew about Tuskegee. Those are things I knew about the Tuskegee experiment. Um, History isn't hidden. We got to use our libraries better, you know. Um, and of course, I'm being a little simplistic here. There are some things that are being hidden, but then you have to. The only way you could actually say that is you'd have to know who they're being hidden by and from who. But when it's a vast majority of people, it's less likely that it's hidden. It's more likely that we just lazy. You know, information don't just fall in your lap. You got to go get it. You know, some people say, "Oh, I never knew this," and I'm like, "You weren't trying to know that. That's not even in a lane of information you were trying to get." And so it always amazes me when people who weren't trying to know something are like, "They hid this from me." Nobody had to hide that. You weren't looking for it. Stop doing that. Stop doing that. But anyway, so though my tenure in religion had worked to snuff out the significance of those voices, had snuck out the significance of those voices that had roused such passion in me as a youth, Dr. Brooks' classes worked like a laxative to bring it all back to the forefront. I became a different person after taking her classes. I started wrestling more with who I had become and whether or not it was beneficial to the things that deeply mattered to me. Her classes helped me remember that I became a pastor because I wanted to help people, that I served God because I thought it was the best way to serve people. Sociology and social science taught me that the best way to help people is to intentionally pay attention and then be honest about what you see and feel. Once I gave that liberty to myself, I became much more gracious and understanding of others who had taken a similar liberty. The audacity of others was now my front row seat into the world around me. And then there was Professor Earl Scott, an English professor who spent much of his lecturing time highlighting the chauvinism and anti humanist rhetoric of European literature, chiefly the King James Version of the Bible. You can look this guy up today and see how pissed conservatives were for having to take his class. And I mean that. You can just look up Professor Earl Scott or Mr. Earl Scott or whatever, Troy University, Dothan, and you're going to see how pissed people were. But his classes gave me the freedom to call a spade a spade. They were a reminder that literary criticism is a tool for humanity and one that we should wield wisely in consideration of all the ramifications, harmful or otherwise. If my memory serves me correctly, he identified as a Quaker, which I found to be quite interesting in Southern Alabama. But that was the beauty of college, wasn't it? I'm going to add the word Southern because I did not have it there. Boom. That's what I like doing stuff like this. Um, and there was also Dr. Bill Lipscomb. He was my drama professor for 2 years, and while I had always been passionate about theater and performance, his classes helped me appreciate the performance aspect of my role as an African American preacher. There was a history, a drama, a comedy, and an entire culture behind that performance that I had been too timid to explore before because I thought those things were God and God alone. His classes reintroduced me to the humanity of the pulpit, seeing behind the divine drama into the very soul of the performer. And that's what I was kind of highlighting to earlier. His classes also introduced me to Dionysus and dithyrambs, which would serve to be problematic for my Christian worldview for a myriad of other reasons. Those of you who are familiar with comparative mythology, you might know why. But perhaps the primary reason Dr. Bill's name makes this particular book is because it was in his class that I first heard the phrase suspension of disbelief. I have to be honest with you, this wrecked me theologically. I remember sitting in the stillness wrestling with the discomfort of dissonance as he described the concept. With the casual mention of this apparently well-known phenomenon, Dr. Bill managed to sum up my entire lived experience with my religious faith. That I was suspending my disbelief in order to participate. There's something about knowing that there is a term for what you're doing that makes you think twice about continuing to do it. I didn't get the impression that Dr. Bill Lipscomb was a believer, more of a realist than anything, but if he was, I sincerely hope that he finds no offense in discovering that his classes played a crucial role in my deconversion. The big point here is that by the time I graduated from Troy University, academic integrity had liberated my caged authenticity, and that meant my worldview was in trouble. And I don't just mean religiously. That entire academic experience enabled me with an audacity to critically analyze my relationship with everything, family, friends, and the world around me. That's the end of chapter 2. That was a good one, right? You learned a lot about me, or a little bit about me. Now, this next chapter, and not only did I debate about including this chapter, because this one is a little more personal than some of the other chapters. Like this one, like I talk about my marriage, my first marriage in this book, and I don't consider that as personal. Like I have a whole chapter for that marriage. It's called "My Marriage Was in Shambles." You know, I have a whole chapter for that. But this next chapter, I consider it, just incredibly more personal. And we'll see what you think. Not only did I debate about putting this in the book, even after putting it in the book, because obviously it's in there, I debated about whether or not I was going to read this chapter in this sitting. But I think this chapter is the perfect closing for today's video, and so I want to do it because this one was a hard one to write, but it was a defining moment for me in 2014. Oh man, there were so many though. But this one, I had defining moments for religion, defining moments for education, defining moments for my marriage. This was a defining moment for my relationship with the idea of family and my role in it. And so the name of this chapter is called A Funny Thing Happened. So perhaps the most defining moment of the year for me came one random day when I was on my way from my church office to the hotel that my family was living in because my finances were in such disrepair. See, we've gotten personal already. I stopped by a gas station that my mother was managing to pick up the usual before heading home, a pack of Newports and a few snacks. As she was bagging up my snacks, she told me that she had seen my twin earlier that day. My first thought was that she was talking about a good friend of mine who, because of our similar build, was often misconstrued as my brother. He had also served at my church a few times as the keyboard player, um, and so I thought she was talking about him. But no, she was talking about my father. To provide context here, I lived in Alabama and my father lived in Maryland. At that time, I had not seen my father in several years, and we had not had any type of communication. His mother and sisters lived 2 towns over, and I visited them frequently in between my travels to school and to visit my mentor. Not one time had they mentioned that they were expecting my father anytime soon, but nor had I expected them to do so. On one of those visits, I was chastised by my father's mother for not attending a family reunion that I had not been invited to. When I called out the deviation, I was further chastised for changing my phone number so much that no one knew how to get in touch with me. I then offered to update my number in her phone, only to start typing in the number to see my name immediately appear in her list of contacts. My number had not changed in a decade. To be clear, I still have that same number today. As I mentioned, I had 2 beautiful boys, and they had not seen their grandfather for years. And here, my mother was telling me that he was less than 30 minutes away. I checked my oldest son out of Head Start so that he and his brother could get a chance to spend some time with my father. It was completely random and represented a major crack in my dissonance that would contribute heavily to my permission to explore a worldview separate from religion. My relationship with my father's family was complicated, to be sure, not very different from my relationship with my mother's family. I can recall a conversation that I was having with one of my older cousins about life. She was under the impression that I was raised by my father and that I had lived with him for the majority of my life. When I informed her that that was not the case, she was adamant that I was mistaken. Imagine that. I was mistaken about the 16 and a half years of living with various people and the 1.5 year that I had lived with my father. It was an interesting phenomenon to me because my family seemed to be what I call dollar blind. Regardless of how many absolute awful things my father did, many of which were things that they had counted others unworthy of redemption because of, he was innocent in their eyes because of his ability to bankroll their entertainment. At least that's how it seemed to me, especially at the moment of having someone infer that they knew more about my life than I did based on their relationship with him. In those days, I had a personal assistant who was primarily responsible for driving me around and running errands for me so that I could occupy myself with the good work of the gospel. I called him up and let him know what had happened and he was happy to tag along. I have to be honest here and reveal that I was not a wealthy man at this juncture in life. You heard how this chapter started. My personal assistants were typically young men who had not yet found their way in life, but were able to find a temporary sense of meaning in serving. All of them became close associates, and this one was close enough that I was willing to trust him with this vulnerable moment in my life. I arrived at my father's sister's house later that afternoon with my assistant and my 2 sons to a scene of family members that I hadn't seen in years. I couldn't help but to wonder how many were likely bothered by my impromptu appearance. I felt like an absolute uh, outsider, and for the first time, I was willing to admit to myself that it wasn't the first time. Like, that's a yeah. And I remember pulling up Ozark, Alabama, my Aunt Frida's house, all the cars there, seeing all the people are there. And I think what it was, because remember, my father's come in from Maryland. I find out about it because he accidentally stops at a gas station in Dothan, which is where I live. Now, he came down from Maryland to Ozark, which is like 30 minutes north of me. He came into Dothan, the city I lived in, and only accidentally ran into my mother for her to tell me about it. And even after he did that, he didn't ask her for my number. He didn't call me. And this is what I mentioned by that. This is what I meant earlier when I made that statement, that crack in dissonance, you know. So I was an outsider for sure. I was finally allowing myself to wrestle with that. That when we pulled up, like number one, you came into Dothan. You came into Dothan, which means you came into Dothan to see somebody. And it wasn't your son, and it wasn't your grandchildren. They weren't a thought. But it wasn't just you. There was a whole family of people who knew you were coming. All of them who had my number, many of them that I had interacted with recently. Nobody said anything. And so it amazes me that he was surprised in 2016 when I said, "Hey, you can just forget my name. Don't even worry about it no more. We're good. We're good. I give you permission to no longer have to be a father. Peace on." Um, so, but yeah, I felt like an absolute outsider, and for the first time, I was willing to admit to myself that it wasn't the first time. My assistant felt more comfortable with my family than I did. There was a certain moment in the evening when one of my uncles, one of which I was fond of, was sharing fantastical stories while lighting up a cigar, as he usually did. For whatever reason, it was extremely important to me to feel human that night. Perhaps I subconsciously believed that the disconnect that existed between my father's family and I was grounded in the fact that I was a pastor. My family was not anti-religious by any stretch of the imagination, but on either side, there had never been a pastor in the family. On this night, I was willing to consider that perhaps the perception of me as a man of the cloth had prevented me from being received well by my family, as it had been my path since my pre-adolescent years. On that night, I wanted to be regular, just like them. Not anymore. Perhaps thinking that my father would see my humanity and bestow on me the love that he had withheld. So while my uncle was telling his stories and striking up his cigar, and my cousins were joining in with their own vices, I decided to pull out one of my Newports and indulge as one of the family members. I will never forget the absolute look of horror and disgust that came across my grandmother's face. I got to be honest with you, this woman is not a woman I have very much respect for in the long scheme of things. But to be honest, I don't have respect for much of my family members anymore, period. Because I'm no longer at that place where I'm willing to pretend that you weren't who you were. I can't play those games. And you can thank Professor Earl Scott for that. I got to call a spade a spade. Now, I understood that it was possibly due to the fact that I was a pastor, but to be fair, I was a pastor who only practiced what I had preached. I had never preached against smoking, and my family attended a local African Methodist Episcopal church where smoking was not condemned. As a matter of fact, their preacher smoked. I can remember feeling devastated and quickly put my cigarette away. My father's mother looked over at me sternly and said, "Don't hypocrite yourself." I have to be honest and admit that I was offended for a number of reasons. As I stated earlier, I made a habit of practicing what I preached, and my theology did not include a prohibition of tobacco, neither did hers. And my family had not taken the slightest interest in my life as a pastor, so she had not even the slightest right to claim that she knew my theology enough to insinuate that I was being a hypocrite. Ultimately, what I end up realizing after that encounter is that these people don't fucking know me and don't care to know me. And I'm through pretending like they do. I felt judged and shamed in the same moment, and the sting was all too familiar. To add further insult to injury, many of my cousins, aunts, and uncles were simultaneously high and or drunk on a variety of substances, including my father. Yet none of them were subject to such chastisement. The standard was obviously different for me, and I felt like it was meant to be a punishment, punitive. It was a reminder that I, as the child of the outsider, could never even truly understand the rules of being part of this family. And to be clear, my father's family was not the Winterbournes by any stretch of the imagination. I started this story here because this night delivered a cornucopia of experiences. I saw the shadows of my family that I had never been privy to before, and in many ways, this was due to the navigation of my personal assistant. This was more his environment. then it was mine. Contrary to the opinions my grandmother had drawn about me, he understood that I was just as uncomfortable in this environment as they were having me there. Perhaps he couldn't articulate it at the time, but I think he understood that his pastor was just looking for an outlet to be human without harming anyone. He had a front row seat to my life and struggles for a few years and likely understood how isolated I had grown to feel. And I want to add to that sense of isolation. I felt so isolated because I felt like I was supposed to want them in my life. Once I started realizing that I don't have to want people in my life who don't want to be in my life, it stopped feeling like isolation. This was one of the most important nights of my life because not only did I experiment with my own humanity, but I was able to see into the humanity of my assistant in a way that perhaps I was never able to appreciate before. As a pastor, I lived my life in somewhat of a bubble, and the world was happening outside of that bubble. That night reminded me that the world was my family, and my assistant, a virtual stranger, was more adept at navigating that world than I. He was intuitively aware of which rooms were tobacco rooms, marijuana rooms, alcohol rooms, other rooms, or any combination of the aforementioned. I was completely outside of my element, but I was intent on getting an understanding. For an unshakable reason, I wanted to know what separated me from my family in a way that had not separated this stranger that I had just introduced to them. I knew that several of my cousins were smokers of the devil's lettuce, and had never judged them for it. Judgment to that degree was simply not a part of my theology. I had even tried the substance during a few moments of peer pressure and found nothing to it. Granted, I had quite a few deep-coded biases that had previously worked to prevent me from enjoying such a substance. But tonight was different. I almost want to quote a Betty Wright song, you know. Damn, I should not have been listening to that song so young. All right. I had my assistant to direct me to the rooms that my cousins were in, and I proceeded. For the first time in my life, the very first time, technically, to truly partake in a smoke session. I don't remember anything they were talking about, but I remember that life changed for me almost in an instant. I had recently seen an episode of the show Boondocks where the grandfather, played by John Witherspoon, tries cannabis for the first time, and everything in his life seemed to become visually brighter. That was my exact experience. Everything just kind of lit up, right? I don't know what was different this time from the handful of times that I had attempted the substance before, but that night I drifted away within myself and began to have conversations that I had outlawed for decades. And by the time we left that night, I didn't give a damn about that family anymore. That's some good shit, right? But in all honesty, I had bigger fish to fry. As beautiful as the world was revealing itself to be to me in an altered state, my reality in it was anything but. And despite feeling judged and shamed by my family, for the first time in a long time, I was exposed to a stream of thoughts that were uniquely my own. Familial, cultural, and religious ideologies all seemed to fade away as I was finally able to inspect my life unabated. As a side note, this moment led to the publishing of my first book, Significant, primarily because it was on that night that I started doing the work to lay claim to my own personal significance. It was the first time that I was willing to live as one of them, even while not being accepted by them. And that's how I began to find myself. A version of me emerged that night that no longer needed their acceptance. And perhaps that was my slippery slope. Notice how this story began with my mother, my children, my assistant, and my father and my grandmother. But by the end of the night, it was uniquely my story, one that I was no longer content to spectate from afar. It was time for me to play an active role in my life, and what a slippery slope that would prove to be. As my assistant was driving my sons and I back to our hotel, it was clear to me that there was no God governing the activities of my life. I was able to clearly see that my family members had found all types of sources of joy, without any need of a God to serve or glorify. It had never made much sense to me before, but after that night, I was willing to pursue a similar journey. And that is how that chapter ends. And that was the one that honestly, that's the one that almost didn't make the book. That's the one that almost didn't make the book because it's just like, okay, this one is a little too personal. Well, and it's not that like I don't mind personal. That's a part of the performative aspect of who I am. That's the art aspect. You know, there's two sayings we used to have in church. I set myself on fire so that others can come and watch me burn. You know what I'm saying? And another one is like, I'm gonna get naked first so everybody else is comfortable. You know what I'm saying? And that's art, you know, in the sense. That's the performative aspect. But it was there's so much going on. And that chapter represents one day. That's one day. I just randomly stopped by the gas station that my mom worked at. And she says, "Hey, your dad's in town." In Dothan? What? How? And I remember wrestling with the thoughts at the time because this wasn't the first time this had happened, you know. But I remember wrestling with the thoughts of, man, that man don't love you. Like this family don't give a damn about you. But thoughts like that I had outlawed, you know, because those are negative thoughts. And negative thoughts can't be truthful. Negative thoughts are from the devil. So I had outlawed that type of thinking. And by doing so, I constantly submitted myself to abuse. Like it was emotional torment. Like, and it was, oh my goodness. Now that I'm up from the children's table, I'm not doing that shit no more. I'm like Fantasia Barrino. You don't like me. You don't want me, then don't talk to me. Go ahead and free yourself. And notice in this chapter, there's one thing that's missing. You see a conversation with me and my mother. You see conversations with me and my assistant. You see conversations with me and my grandmother. You even hear about some conversations with me and my cousins. But there is no conversation with me and my father that night. Just, hey, how you doing, man? Love you. And then he floats off in the crowd because he's the celebrity and everybody's glad that he's down, you know, so he can bankroll the party, you know. And it's funny because he's not a celebrity. He's a janitor. I'm not speaking bad on janitors, but it's just funny. That tells you how bad my family is doing when the janitor is bankrolling. You know what I'm saying? But to be fair, he is a janitor. Well, I don't know if he still is because I haven't talked to the man, and at this moment, I'm sure a decade now. But he used to be a janitor at the Capitol, so that was pretty decent money. Nothing in comparison to what his wife makes, though. She's in the CIA. So yeah, uh, man. Okay, there's so much I want to say about that, but I'm gonna bite my tongue because that's not my business to tell, right? But there's so much I want to say about that. But if you notice, there's not one conversation between he and I. Not at this one. Not at this one. I did end up getting invited because I showed up to this randomly. I did get invited to a family reunion that they were planning that year that I had not heard about. So if he didn't go into my mother's store that day, this would have been another family reunion that all of my cousins and all of my aunts and uncles absolutely neglected to tell me about. You know what I'm saying? But I did get an invite to that, and I did go. And he and I had a good conversation there. Well, we sat around the pool area and had a decent conversation because he was proud of me because he had found out that I was becoming popular. You know, and at this time in my life, I was still naive enough to find stuff like that flattering. I don't now. if you've known me for this long, but you can only value me when other people value me, fuck you. Like, no. Seats taken, bitch. No, no, no. You missed your shot. How did you fumble a me? That's a new saying. But no. Um, so I went, we talked. He flattered me. And he said, man, if you ever need anything, I said, we're actually thinking about leaving Alabama. He said, if you ever need anything, man, y'all can definitely come stay with us for a while, a year or so while you're getting on your feet. I'm like, okay, cool. So a few months later, I'm going through my divorce and I reach out to him. He said, you can't come here. Oh, okay. Well, I'm moving up that area. I already have me a place to stay. I have my job squared away. Um, can I come over for dinner? Nah, me and my wife ain't in a good place right now. That's my father. That's my family. But no, let's fast forward a few years back. Few years back before I deconverted. As a matter of fact, this had to be around 2008 because I was pastoring Kingdom International Worship Center, which was a church that I started. It ended up becoming Kingdom Central after it started growing. But I got a call from my father one night, and it was, hey, he was upset. He had been drinking, and I was surprised because he never calls me. So I got this call, and it's like 2008. It's calling. He's a little drunk, and he's my older brother's wedding is coming up, and he's calling me because he's upset about the way that my brother has the information on what is the wedding program. I was going to call it the wedding obituary, but those two words don't go together. Maybe they do, but he's calling to complain about the way these things are worded. So he says, "Pull it up. Go to the website." And I'm like, "Okay." I'm pulling it up, and I'm looking at the website, and for a moment, I feel a sense of like joy, love, acceptance. Because as I'm scrolling through the website, because my father's calling me angry about something that's not on this website or something that's wrong on this website for my brother's wedding. And he's so angry about it that he's calling me, the son that he doesn't really talk to, you know. And so I'm just like, okay. And I notice that on my brother's thing, where he lists his siblings, my name is not on there at all. The dog's name is on there. My name is not. And so I'm thinking, oh man, my dad is calling me because he's upset that my brother didn't include me. And I went to the wedding, mind you. Like my brother knew I was coming to the wedding. I went to my brother's wedding and my brother's graduation. I did too much for people who didn't give a damn if I was there or not. And the thing was, I was going broke to do it. Like, I don't do that shit anymore. Like, if you're having something and you're a long way from me, film that shit, bitch. That's the only way you're getting me there. I'm not going broke to be somewhere where people don't want me to be. No, not doing that. But nope, that's not what it was. He was upset that my brother listed his stepfather first. The man who had actually raised him had listed his stepfather first and listed our father second. He called me because he was second, while being completely blind to the fact that I wasn't even included at all. And then he also, let me take it back a little further. For my brother's wedding, he's the one that convinced me to come, to bring, for me and my wife to travel, to come, to drive all the way up to North Carolina. I forget, Orangeboro, man. And he claimed that he was going to cover our expenses and didn't cover shit. Yeah. So yeah, that's why that chapter was a little hard one for me to write. That's why. Well, it wasn't hard for me to write. It was hard for me to make the decision to include it in this book, and it was definitely hard for me to make the decision whether to talk about it today. But I did, and we made it through the next chapter, which we're not going to read. I just wanted to give you a little preview so you know what's in the book, and if it piques your interest, you can check it out for yourself. It's available on Amazon for pre-order now and for sale on Black Friday. I'm going to have to get better with saying that. But thank you all for hanging out with me today. I love to see what your thoughts are in the comments. And if you haven't already, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell, consider joining, supporting, or connecting with this community, channel, or content in any way that makes sense for you. And of course, check out our merch, man. We have some of the dopest merch in the game. It's one of the easiest ways that you can support this community while getting some real cool value out of it on the other end. All right, so that's all I have for now. I love y'all so much. Until next time, keep rising, stay progressive, and stay beautiful. Only if you can. I ain't trying to put no pressure on you. I'll holla.